Why ADX Florence in Colorado is worse than death row. The most secure prison in America does not execute people. It doesn't run gas chambers or lethal injection rooms. There are no last meals, no final walks, no scheduled dates with death. And yet, some men sent here have said they would rather face a death sentence than live inside these walls. Hidden in the high desert of Colorado stands ADX Florence, a facility built not just to confine the body, but to neutralize the mind. Silence is enforced. Human contact is almost erased. Time itself begins to blur. What kind of place makes death row seem merciful by comparison? And what really happens behind doors that almost never open? What comes next is even harder to understand. ADX Florence was designed for one purpose: total control. Not rehabilitation. Not reform. Control. Opened in the 1990s, it became the federal government's answer to inmates considered too dangerous, too influential, or too uncontrollable for any other prison in the country. These were men accused of running criminal networks from inside cells, orchestrating violence through coded messages, or attacking staff and inmates repeatedly. The philosophy behind the design was simple and cold: if communication is power, remove communication. If movement creates risk, remove movement. If human interaction creates opportunity, remove interaction. The result is a prison where isolation is not punishment, it is the operating system. From the outside, the buildings look almost plain. Low concrete structures, neutral colors, minimal windows. But every line, every angle, every material serves a security purpose. Walls are reinforced. Doors are solid steel. Sight lines are engineered so that no prisoner can see another face during routine movement. It is not built to intimidate. It is built to eliminate variables. And inside, the routine begins immediately. A standard cell inside ADX Florence measures roughly the size of a bathroom. Concrete bed. Concrete desk. Concrete stool. A toilet sink unit made from stainless steel. No loose objects. No removable parts. The window is narrow and angled upward, designed so the inmate can see sky, but not the horizon. You can tell it's daytime. You cannot see the world. Lighting is controlled externally. Doors are controlled remotely. Many movements are automated. Even the smallest privilege, a shower, a medical visit, a legal meeting, happens under layered restraint procedures. In many units, inmates spend about 23 hours a day inside this cell. Alone. Not quiet alone, sealed alone. Imagine not touching another human being for months. Then years. Then longer. How does the mind respond to that? We'll come back to that. Because the psychological effects are where this story becomes even darker. Daily life inside ADX Florence runs on precision timing. Wake up is early. Meals arrive through a slot in the door. No cafeteria. No group seating. No conversation across tables. Food is passed in, trays are passed out. Contact lasts seconds. Movement outside the cell, when permitted, happens in restraints. Hands secured. Often additional restraints at the waist or legs depending on classification level. Escort teams are trained for rapid response. Routes are cleared before transport. Doors are never opened casually. Even recreation is isolation. Instead of a yard, many inmates are placed in what prisoners sometimes call a dog run, a narrow, enclosed concrete space with fencing overhead. You can walk in small circles. You can look up at the sky through mesh. You cannot approach anyone else. No pickup games. No weight piles. No social exercise. Just pacing. And pacing becomes a survival habit. Because when the environment doesn't change, the body creates motion to feel alive. But movement isn't the hardest part. It's the silence between movements. In most prisons, sound never stops. Voices, arguments, televisions, metal doors, distant shouting. Noise becomes background. Here, silence becomes pressure. Some former inmates have described hearing their own heartbeat as if it were external. Others say time stretches strangely. Hours feel like days, days collapse into memory gaps. Without regular human interaction, the brain loses anchors. Psychologists have long warned about extended solitary confinement. Effects can include anxiety, depression, memory problems, and perceptual distortions. Not every inmate experiences this the same way, but enough do that it has become a serious legal and ethical debate. And yet ADX Florence continues to operate on this model because officials argue the alternative risk is worse. Who are the men placed here? That answer changes how you see the place. And what happens next raises an uncomfortable question about safety versus humanity. ADX Florence houses inmates considered among the most dangerous in federal custody. Some are convicted of terrorism-related crimes. Some led violent criminal organizations. Some attacked staff repeatedly in other prisons. Others were accused of directing operations from behind bars. The classification process is layered and bureaucratic. Placement here is not supposed to be random. It follows documented behavior, threat assessments, and internal reviews. Once assigned, however, leaving is extremely difficult. There are step-down programs, structured paths where inmates can earn slightly more privileges through long-term compliance. But progress can take years. One disciplinary incident can reset the clock. Imagine playing a game where one mistake sends you back to the beginning, and the game lasts a decade. How does someone maintain discipline under those conditions? Some develop rigid personal routines. Exercise cycles. Reading schedules. Mental math drills. Structured prayer times. Memory exercises. Anything to build mental scaffolding against isolation. Others struggle, sometimes quietly, sometimes not. And the institution is built to respond quickly when struggle turns into disruption. Power inside ADX Florence is not loud. It is procedural. There are no dramatic confrontations most days. No chaotic yard fights. Control here is exercised through systems, locked doors, camera coverage, layered authorization. Authority is embedded in process rather than personality. Orders are documented. Movements logged. Interactions recorded. In many ways, this reduces spontaneous abuse risk. But it also reduces flexibility. When systems dominate, exceptions become rare. And when exceptions are rare, mercy can become procedural instead of human. Staff assigned here receive specialized training. The environment is stressful for them too. Constant vigilance. Limited margin for error. High-profile inmates. National security concerns. Every routine action carries weight. Because if something goes wrong here, it is never small. But there's something even more difficult than the daily routine. It's what happens over years instead of days. And that is where ADX Florence begins to resemble something many inmates say is worse than a death sentence. On death row, there is an endpoint, however grim. Appeals, dates, delays, but an eventual conclusion exists. At ADX Florence, many inmates face sentences so long they functionally equal life without release. Decades in extreme isolation. Decades in controlled silence. Decades in a space where every day looks nearly identical to the last. No final date. No defined ending. Just continuation. Some legal advocates argue that indefinite extreme isolation is a form of living disappearance. Not execution, but erasure from normal human experience. Supporters argue that certain offenders created such high risk that no other environment can contain them safely. Both sides agree on one thing. This is the most restrictive federal prison in the United States. And we haven't even reached the most controversial part yet. Because the internal disciplinary measures, and how easily privileges can vanish, add another layer to the story. That's where we're going next. There is a phrase sometimes used quietly among long-term isolation inmates: progress is fragile. Inside this facility, discipline is not just about punishment. It directly controls access to the smallest elements of human variation. A radio. A few more books. Slightly increased recreation time. Limited program materials. These are not comforts here, they are lifelines. The step-down system is the only structured path out of the most restrictive units. On paper, it looks straightforward. Demonstrate long-term compliance. Avoid incident reports. Follow instructions precisely. Participate in approved activities. Maintain stability. In reality, it can take years to advance a single level. Each stage slightly increases environmental stimulation. More property allowed. More reading material. Sometimes limited group programming under tight controls. But every gain is conditional, and reversible. A single infraction, even a minor one, can result in demotion. Imagine living where every word spoken through a steel door, every delay in following an order, every emotional reaction carries the risk of losing months of progress. Some inmates become hyper-controlled, emotionally flat, and ritualistic in behavior. Others become brittle under the pressure. Because the system doesn't just measure conduct. It measures consistency over time. And time is the one resource that stretches endlessly here. What does that do to a person's sense of self? The answer is uncomfortable, and it becomes clearer when we look at how punishment works inside a prison already built on restriction. When someone violates rules inside a Supermax environment, the response does not look like traditional prison discipline. There are no yard bans, many inmates already have no yard access. There is no segregation, they are already segregated. Instead, punishments become even more granular. Property can be removed. Access to reading material reduced. Communication privileges delayed or suspended. Program eligibility paused. Movement frequency cut back. Sensory input lowered further. In extreme cases, monitoring increases and environmental stimuli decrease. The goal is behavioral compliance through environmental control, not confrontation. Critics argue that when the baseline is already near total isolation, layering additional restriction risks psychological harm. Administrators counter that they need a structured behavioral system to maintain safety and order among inmates with histories of serious violence or institutional disruption. Both claims can exist at the same time. But here's the deeper tension: when the environment itself is the punishment, every adjustment becomes magnified. A radio is not entertainment. It is mental structure. A book is not leisure. It is cognitive survival. And when those disappear, the mind has fewer anchors left. So how do inmates adapt long-term? The survival strategies are more deliberate than most people expect. Long-term isolation forces invention. Many inmates build strict daily regimens down to the minute. Exercise cycles repeated every hour. Reading schedules broken into timed segments. Writing projects mapped across months. Some memorize entire books. Some learn languages through limited materials. Some construct mental routines, memory games, visualization exercises, internal storytelling. Structure becomes medicine. Without structure, days dissolve into each other. With structure, at least there is sequence, and sequence creates psychological footholds. Some inmates describe dividing the day into artificial chapters. Morning conditioning. Midday study. Evening reflection. Night mental drills. Not because anyone requires it, but because the alternative is drift. And drift is dangerous in isolation. There are also unofficial survival rules passed quietly through legal correspondence networks and attorney conversations. Keep your sleep cycle stable. Control your reactions during staff interactions. Never let anger decide your next action. Protect your disciplinary record like currency. Because inside this system, it is currency. But even with discipline and structure, not everyone adapts successfully. And that leads to the most debated dimension of all, mental health. What happens when isolation meets vulnerability? Mental health management inside high-security isolation units is one of the most contested topics in modern corrections. Psychological staff conduct evaluations. Monitoring protocols exist. Intervention thresholds are defined. But the environment itself remains inherently restrictive, and that creates a built-in contradiction. Treatment ideally depends on interaction, trust, and engagement. Isolation reduces interaction, limits trust building, and constrains engagement. Some inmates remain stable for years. Others show visible decline, increased anxiety, emotional withdrawal, sleep disruption, cognitive slowing. Responses vary widely depending on personality, history, coping skills, and length of confinement. Legal challenges over the years have questioned whether extended extreme isolation is appropriate for inmates with serious mental illness. In response, policies have evolved, screening has increased, and placement criteria have been revised, but debate continues. Because this question has no easy answer. How do you securely contain someone considered highly dangerous while also preserving their psychological stability? Every solution seems to create a new problem. And nowhere is that tension more visible than in the stories of inmates who entered the facility already known worldwide. Their cases changed how the public viewed this place, and how the government defended it. We're going there next. Some facilities become famous because of escapes. This one became famous because escape is considered nearly impossible, and because of who is held inside. High-profile offenders brought global attention to a prison that was never designed for publicity. Security experts studied it. Human rights groups criticized it. Legislators defended it. Former inmates described it in stark terms after transfer or release. The public narrative often simplifies it into a label, the most secure prison. But labels hide details. The real story is not just about who is inside. It's about what daily existence costs a human mind over long spans of time. And that cost is why some inmates have said, quietly, seriously, they would choose a death sentence instead. Not because death is easy. But because certainty can feel lighter than endless psychological compression. We're about to examine that claim directly, what comparison they're really making, and why it isn't as simple as it sounds. When inmates compare this place to death row, they are not talking about the method of dying. They are talking about the psychology of waiting versus the psychology of endlessness. On death row, time is heavy, but defined. Appeals move through courts. Dates are set and postponed. Legal teams visit. The case itself keeps moving, even if slowly. There is a narrative arc, however grim. In long-term Supermax isolation, there may be no arc at all. No final hearing that changes everything. No scheduled conclusion. Just administrative reviews spaced months or years apart, often producing the same result, continue placement. Some inmates have described death row as a tunnel with a visible exit, while extreme isolation feels like an open desert with no horizon. That distinction matters psychologically. Certainty, even when frightening, gives the mind something to measure against. Indefinite isolation removes measurement. Without milestones, motivation becomes harder to sustain. Without variation, memory becomes harder to organize. Days stop feeling separate. That is why comparisons to death row emerge, not as drama, but as emotional math. But the comparison raises another question. If communication is restricted, how do these perspectives reach the outside at all? The answer reveals another tightly controlled layer of life inside the facility. Communication from inside is filtered, delayed, and monitored. Mail is screened. Legal correspondence is handled under protected procedures but still processed through secure channels. Phone access, when permitted, is limited and scheduled. Calls are monitored except for approved legal lines. Visits are rare and highly controlled, often conducted behind thick glass, sometimes through audio systems rather than direct speech. Every channel is structured to prevent hidden messaging or operational coordination. For inmates previously accused of directing crimes from prison, these restrictions are considered essential safeguards. But they also compress personal connection to a minimum. Family relationships strain under the weight of distance and procedure. Conversations become formal, timed, and emotionally careful. Even small talk changes under monitoring. Some inmates choose to reduce outside contact rather than experience repeated emotional resets after brief connections. Others hold on to correspondence as their primary link to identity beyond the cell. Letters become journals. Updates become memory anchors. A single page of handwriting can carry emotional weight far beyond its words. But communication limits don't only affect inmates. They also shape how staff work, and how authority functions minute by minute inside the prison. And what happens when authority must act quickly here is very different from what happens in other facilities. Emergency response inside a Supermax environment is built on overwhelming coordination. If an inmate refuses restraints, blocks a door slot, or threatens self-harm or staff harm, response teams deploy with layered protective equipment and strict formation tactics. Every move is rehearsed. Every role defined. Communication is short and coded. Speed matters, but control matters more. Force, when used, is documented and reviewed. Cameras are often active. Reports are detailed. Because at this level of security, every incident carries legal and institutional consequences. The paradox is this: violence inside such a tightly controlled prison is statistically rarer than in many lower security facilities, yet preparation for violence is constant. It has to be. Because the individuals housed here are not assessed by who they were once, but by what they might still be capable of under pressure. That risk-based philosophy shapes everything from architecture to meal delivery. And nowhere is that philosophy more visible than in how the buildings themselves are designed. What looks simple is actually strategic. What looks minimal is intentional. Supermax architecture is behavior control in concrete form. Corridors are designed to eliminate blind spots. Corners are angled. Sight lines are calculated. Materials are chosen for durability and tamper resistance. Fixtures are built into walls. Furniture cannot be moved or broken down into weapon parts. Even acoustics are considered. Sound dampening reduces communication between cells. Ventilation systems are designed to prevent passing objects or messages. Doors are remotely operated from secure control rooms. Movement can be staged in layers. One door opens only after another locks. This creates security airlocks between zones. The design reduces the need for direct confrontation. It replaces physical dominance with mechanical certainty. But mechanical certainty creates emotional distance. And emotional distance changes how time feels, not only for inmates, but for staff as well. Because working in an environment built around isolation has its own psychological cost. That part of the story is rarely discussed. And it adds another layer to why this institution remains controversial even among corrections professionals. Officers assigned to Supermax duty operate in a different rhythm than typical correctional staff. Interaction is more controlled, more procedural, less conversational. Relationships with inmates are intentionally limited to maintain professional boundaries and security clarity. That distance protects safety, but it can also produce emotional fatigue. Routine here is intense. Alertness must stay high even during quiet shifts. Mistakes carry greater consequence. Complacency is considered the primary threat. Training emphasizes consistency, documentation, and emotional neutrality. Some staff rotate assignments to avoid burnout. Others specialize long-term and develop strong procedural expertise. Support systems exist, but the work remains uniquely demanding. Because unlike chaotic prisons, stress here comes from sustained vigilance rather than constant noise. Stillness can be as draining as disorder. And this dual pressure, on inmates and staff, feeds into the ongoing legal and ethical debates surrounding the facility. Those debates have reached courtrooms more than once. And the arguments on both sides are stronger than many expect. Over the years, lawsuits have challenged extended extreme isolation practices, arguing that long-term solitary confinement can violate constitutional protections under certain conditions, especially for inmates with serious mental illness. Government attorneys have defended the system as necessary for national security and institutional safety, emphasizing classification criteria, review processes, and step-down opportunities. Courts have sometimes ordered policy adjustments, improved mental health screening, modified placement rules, expanded review procedures. But they have not eliminated the Supermax model. Why? Because the central dilemma remains unresolved. If a small number of inmates have repeatedly demonstrated the ability to organize violence or direct criminal activity even while incarcerated, where should they be housed? Every alternative creates risk somewhere. So the system chooses concentration of risk in one place, under maximum control. That decision is administrative. Its consequences are human. And the human stories, how individuals change over long isolation, are the most difficult part to measure. Because change in isolation is slow, uneven, and often invisible from the outside. Which brings us to the question that lingers over everything here. What does long-term extreme isolation actually do to a person's identity? That is where this story turns inward, and where the final section becomes the most unsettling. Some sentences end with a date. Others end with a number. But places like this are measured in something else: silence, routine, and the slow weight of passing years. Extreme security may protect the outside world. But it also creates a question that never fully goes away: how much isolation can a human mind endure before the punishment becomes something more than confinement? The walls don't answer. The records only show fragments. The rest lives in the hours no one sees. And long after the doors close for the night, the debate continues.